Struggling mountain man spent his last $1 on a too-wild Apache girl at auction. That's what the town sneered. But they didn't see the fire in her eyes, or the silence between them that said more than words ever could. He thought he was buying time before the snow. She carried the weight of a world that didn't forgive. In the high country, where law fades with the wind and firelight means trust, something dangerous was watching. And when the bell tolls and boots come for blood, one question will thunder louder than any rifle. What's a soul worth when no one's left to bid? Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. The October wind whipped down Main Street, rattling the weathered signs of Turquoise Crossing storefronts. Clay McKinnon adjusted the stack of pelts over his shoulder, his bad leg protesting with each step on the hard-packed dirt. The familiar scent of wood smoke and horse leather filled the air, but something else charged the morning. Excitement, cruel and eager, like vultures circling. "Surplus people auction," a boy shouted, running past with a fistful of handbills. "Counties selling off the wards." Clay's weathered face tightened. He'd seen such sales before, back when he rode scout for the army. Towns claiming Christian virtue while trading souls like cattle. His fingers brushed the single silver dollar in his pocket, all that remained after a lean season in the Windbrush Mountains. The town square filled quickly. Merchants closed their shops, and ranch hands left their posts to gather around the wooden platform where Sheriff Amos Lott stood, chest puffed out beneath his tin star. One by one, he brought forward the wards, old men, worn-out miners, a widow with consumption. Each found a buyer, their lives measured in copper pennies. "Last one," Lott announced, gesturing to his deputy. "Apache girl, 18 years, county's tired of feeding her." They brought her forward in iron cuffs, though she moved with natural grace. Her black hair hung loose around sharp cheekbones, and her eyes burned with quiet defiance. Clay recognized the look. He'd seen it in wounded wolves, proud even in traps. "Too wild for domestic work," Lott continued. "Won't take instruction, opening bid at 50 cents. Silence fell across the square. The crowd shifted, muttering about savages and heathens. Clay's hand tightened around his silver dollar as the girl, Atsa, according to the paper pinned to her dress, stared straight ahead, refusing to meet their gaze. 40 cents? Lott tried again. 30? Come now, folks. She's young and strong. Someone must have work for her. Send her back to the reservation, someone shouted. Others laughed. Clay stepped forward, his boots scraping in the dust. $1. The crowd parted, turning to stare. Sheriff Lott's eyes narrowed. "McKinnon? Didn't expect to see you down from your mountain." He gestured at Clay's leg. "War wounds still bothering you?" "The dollar," Clay said quietly. "Will it suffice?" Lott studied him, then shrugged. "Your funeral, old man. You know what they say about her kind." "I reckon I know what they say about my kind, too." Clay pulled out his silver dollar, letting it catch the morning light. The coin had traveled with him since Appomattox, a reminder of debts that couldn't be measured in metal. Now it bought something beyond price, a human life. The sheriff produced papers, and Clay signed them with careful strokes. His schoolmaster father had insisted on proper penmanship, even for a boy who preferred forests to books. As he wrote, he felt Atsa's eyes on him, calculating, measuring his worth. "Remove the cuffs," Clay said. Lott hesitated, then complied. The iron fell away, leaving red marks on Atsa's wrists. She rubbed them slowly, still silent. Clay led the way to where his horse waited. He mounted carefully, favoring his left leg, then extended a hand to help Atsa up behind him. She ignored it, swinging into place with practiced ease. They were halfway down Main Street when she spoke, her English crisp and clear as mountain water. "What do you want with me?" Clay didn't turn around. "Nothing. You're free to leave any time." "Free?" The word carried years of broken promises. "There's no such thing." Maybe not, Clay admitted, but you can ride with me until you decide different. They passed beneath the town's wooden arch, hooves drumming a steady rhythm on the hard earth. Behind them, Turquoise Crossing buzzed with fresh gossip about Clay McKinnon's foolishness. Ahead lay the Windbrush Mountains, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Clay felt Atsa's tension in how lightly she held his coat, ready to jump at the first wrong move. He understood. Trust, like freedom, had to be earned. For now, the morning wind and the steady motion of the horse filled the silence between them. Speaking of possibilities, neither was ready to name. The silver dollar that had lived in Clay's pocket now rested in Sheriff Lott's strongbox, but its weight somehow remained, transformed into something both heavier and more precious. A choice made, a life changed, and a journey begun in the space of a single autumn morning. The juniper wood popped and hissed in the small fire, sending sparks dancing into the darkening sky. Clay settled onto his bedroll, careful to keep the flames between himself and Atsa. She perched like a wary hawk on a fallen log, her back pressed against a boulder, refusing to relax even as evening deepened into night. Clay pulled dried beef and hard biscuits from his saddlebag. Hungry? He held out a portion, but Atsa turned her head away, arms crossed tight against the cooling air. Suit yourself. He set the food halfway between them, within easy reach. The firelight caught the raw marks on her wrists where the shackles had been, and Clay felt a familiar shame twist in his gut. He'd seen too many such marks in his scouting days. When he pulled out his wool blanket, worn but clean, Atsa's eyes tracked his movement. Clay tossed it gently in her direction. Night gets cold up here. She didn't touch it until he lay down on his own bedroll, positioning himself so she could see his hands. Only then did she reach for the blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders without a word of thanks. Through the night, whenever Clay stirred, he caught the gleam of her eyes in the dying firelight. She dozed in short bursts, never fully sleeping, ready to bolt at the slightest threat. Clay understood. Trust came harder than kindness in these mountains. Morning brought frost and aching joints. Clay's bad leg protested as they mounted up, heading north into the rising sun. The trail wound steadily upward, through stands of pine and aspen, their leaves already turned gold. His horse picked its way carefully over loose shale and exposed roots. By midday, the old wound was screaming. Clay tried to hide his wincing, but Atsa's sharp eyes missed nothing. When his bandage began to slip, soaked through with sweat, she suddenly spoke. "Stop!" Her voice carried the crack of command. "You'll fall and break your fool neck." Clay reined in, surprised. Atsa slid from behind him and stood waiting, hands on hips. "Show me." He hesitated, then carefully dismounted. The bandage had worked loose, exposing the ugly scar that ran from knee to ankle. Without ceremony, Atsa knelt and began unwinding the cloth. "My mother taught me about wounds," she said, her touch clinical but careful. "At Fort Cummings. She translated for the agency doctor, learned his medicine." Clay held still as she rewrapped the leg with practiced efficiency. "She taught you well." "She taught me many things." Atsa's voice carried old grief beneath its sharpness. "English, reading, the white man's God." She tied off the bandage with a firm knot. "Fat lot of good it did her." Clay didn't press for more. Some stories needed darkness and trust to be told, and they had neither yet. They rode on in silence as shadows lengthened across the trail. That evening, Clay built another fire in a sheltered hollow. This time, when he offered food, Atsa took it. She ate quickly, like someone used to having meals snatched away. But she ate. The fire had burned low when she spoke again. "I have nowhere to go." The words seemed to surprise her, as if she hadn't meant to say them aloud. Clay poked at the embers with a stick. "Got a cabin up ahead. Need to cut wood before the snows come." He kept his voice casual, offering fact rather than charity. Could use an extra pair of hands, if you're of a mind to stay a while." Atsa said nothing, but she didn't move away when Clay added another log to the fire. It was answer enough for now. They reached the cabin the next afternoon. It wasn't much to look at. A simple log structure with moss growing between the chinked walls and a slight sag in the roof that would need fixing. But smoke still rose straight from the stone chimney, and the small barn looked solid enough to weather another winter. Clay dismounted slowly, his legs stiff from riding. He watched as Atsa took in the clearing, noting the stack of logs waiting to be split, the vegetable patch gone wild with autumn weeds, the creek burbling just beyond the trees. Her face gave nothing away, but her shoulders lowered slightly, the first easing of tension he'd seen since Turquoise Crossing. "Well," he said, leading his horse toward the barn, "that's home." Atsa didn't respond, but she followed him to help unload their gear. When Clay looked back, her tracks in the dirt showed no sign of turning away. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a beginning, as fragile as frost and just as likely to melt away. For now, though, she had chosen to stay, and that would have to be enough. Clay's cabin settled into a steady rhythm as autumn deepened. Each morning, frost painted the windows, while wood smoke curled from the chimney into the crisp mountain air. The sound of axe meeting wood echoed through the clearing as Clay split logs, his bad leg braced carefully with each swing. Atsa watched his technique from the doorway, then wordlessly took up a second axe. Though smaller than Clay's, her strikes landed true, the wood splitting clean along its grain. By midday, they'd built up impressive piles on either side of the chopping block. "Reckon that'll do for now," Clay said, wiping his brow. He gestured toward the cabin's roof, where patches of sky showed through worn shingles. "Got other work needs tending." Together they climbed up, Clay moving carefully on his stiff leg. Atsa proved nimbler, scrambling across the rough-hewn boards with sure feet. She helped him nail fresh shingles in place, her small hands steady with the hammer. When rain came that evening, not a single drop found its way inside. In the kitchen, Clay taught her the basics of frontier cooking. "Ain't fancy," he said, stirring a pot of cornmeal mush, "but it fills the belly." Atsa watched the technique, then took over the next morning, adding wild onions she'd discovered near the creek. The sharp flavor brought life to the simple meal. She showed her worth in other ways too. While Clay worked on winter preparations, Atsa disappeared into the forest, returning with arms full of herbs and roots. She laid them out to dry in neat rows along the windowsills, each bundle tied with careful knots. "Good for fever," she explained, holding up a cluster of small white flowers. "This one stops bleeding. This makes tea for cough." Her knowledge ran deep, passed down through generations of her people. In the evenings, Clay would settle into his chair by the fire, drawing out his worn leather psalter. The book's pages were dog-eared, marked with years of daily reading. His voice, rough from disuse, grew smoother as he read aloud words of comfort and strength. Atsa never joined in, but she'd sit cross-legged on the floor, working with her carving knife on pieces of soft pine. Shavings curled at her feet as she shaped the wood with practiced strokes. Though she kept her eyes on her work, her head would tilt slightly toward Clay's voice, listening. One cold morning, Clay stepped outside to find a perfect rabbit snare strung between two young aspens. The craftsmanship showed years of practice, the loops precise, the trigger mechanism delicate but strong. "Where'd you learn to make these?" he asked over breakfast. Atsa shrugged, not meeting his eyes. "Always known how." She pushed her bowl away and headed outside, ending the conversation. When supplies ran low, Clay knew he couldn't put off a trip to town any longer. "Need flour for winter," he told Atsa over supper. "Be gone 2 days, maybe 3 with my leg the way it is." She nodded once, face unreadable. The next morning, Clay mounted up slowly, his legs stiff in the cold. He looked back once to see Atsa standing in the doorway, straight-backed and still as stone. The journey proved harder than expected. His leg ached fierce on the return trip, laden with supplies. Dark clouds threatened snow, hurrying him along the mountain trails. When he finally rode into the clearing 2 days later, the cabin looked different. Neat stacks of split wood lined the walls. The vegetable patch had been cleared of weeds, and smoke rose from the chimney in a steady stream. Inside, the cabin had been transformed. Floors swept clean, shelves organized, dried herbs hanging in orderly bundles from the rafters. The air carried the rich scent of smoked fish. Atsa emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Creek's full of trout," she said simply. "Thought we might need extra food for winter." That evening, instead of eating from bowls by the fire, they sat together at the rough-hewn table. Clay bowed his head briefly over the meal. Smoked trout, the last of the cornbread, and tea made from Atsa's gathered herbs. Though she didn't join his prayer, she waited until he finished before picking up her fork. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that grows between people who've learned to share space without need for words. Through the window, the first snow began to fall, dusting the mountain world in white. Inside, the fire crackled warm, and two people who'd started as strangers found themselves settling into something that felt almost like home. The crisp mountain morning dawned clear and cold that Sunday. Clay stood before his cracked mirror, attempting to tame his graying beard with an old comb. He'd laid out his best shirt, faded but clean, with only one patch at the elbow. "Reckon we ought to head into town for service?" he called toward Atsa's small room. "Lest folks start talking worse than they already are." A long silence followed before Atsa emerged, wearing a simple dress and a faded brown shawl that had seen better days. She'd braided her dark hair tight against her head, as if trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. The ride to town was quiet, their horses' hooves crunching through the early frost. Clay's old injury made mounting up difficult, but he'd insisted on going. As they approached Turquoise Crossing, Atsa pulled her shawl closer, keeping her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The white-painted church sat proud on the town's main street, its bell already calling folks to worship. Clay helped Atsa dismount, noting how she kept her head low as they climbed the wooden steps. Inside, the murmurs started immediately, whispers hiding behind raised hymnals, sideways glances from beneath Sunday bonnets. They found seats in the back pew, but distance didn't stop the ripple of gossip that moved through the congregation, like wind through prairie grass. A young mother pulled her children closer as they passed. An elderly deacon frowned deeply at his Bible, refusing to look up. Reverend Curtis took the pulpit, his stern face surveying his flock before beginning the morning's sermon. He spoke of charity and Christian duty, but his eyes kept drifting to where Clay and Atsa sat. The words seemed to carry extra weight, laden with unspoken meaning. After the final hymn, as folks filed out to share Sunday dinner with neighbors, the Reverend caught Clay's sleeve. "Brother McKinnon, a word?" His grip was firm as he steered Clay toward his office, leaving Atsa waiting by the door. The preacher's study smelled of leather and pipe smoke. Reverend Curtis closed the door with careful precision before turning to face Clay. "You've always been a good man, McKinnon, a God-fearing man." He paused, choosing his words. "But good intentions can lead down dangerous paths." Clay stood silent, his bad leg aching from the hard pew. "You got a kind heart," the Reverend continued, his voice dropping lower. "But kind hearts have burned for less. There's talk in town already. Questions about propriety. Ain't nothing improper about offering shelter to someone in need," Clay said quietly. "Perhaps not. But there are proper channels for such charity. The mission school in Silver City, for instance." "She ain't a charity case, Reverend. She's a person, same as you or me." The conversation ended there, both men knowing nothing more would be gained by continuing. Outside, Clay found Atsa waiting exactly where he'd left her, straight-backed despite the stares from passing townspeople. "Need supplies," he said gruffly, leading the way toward the general store. But there, too, they met resistance. The storekeeper, Mr. Jenkins, looked up from his ledger as they entered, his face hardening when he saw Atsa. "Can't help you today, McKinnon." "Just need some coffee and sugar," Clay said evenly. "Said I can't help you." Jenkins' eyes never left Atsa. "Not while you got company." Clay's jaw tightened, but he turned without argument, guiding Atsa back outside. They mounted up in silence, leaving Turquoise Crossing and its judgment behind them. The mountain trail stretched before them, winding up toward home. The autumn sun cast long shadows through the pines, and a cool wind carried the scent of coming snow. They'd ridden nearly halfway before Atsa finally spoke. "I ain't ashamed," she said firmly, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "I know what they think." She sat straighter in her saddle, chin lifting. "But I also know I ain't theirs to define." Clay turned in his saddle to look at her properly. The shy girl who'd kept her head down in church was gone. In her place sat someone stronger. Someone who knew her own worth despite what others might say. He nodded slowly, seeing her perhaps more clearly than he had before. That evening, as they sat down to their simple supper of beans and cornbread, Clay did something he'd never done before. Instead of leading Grace himself, he looked across at Atsa. "Would you mind saying the blessing tonight?" Surprise flickered across her face, quickly replaced by quiet dignity. She bowed her head, speaking softly in Apache first, then English. "Creator of all things, we thank you for this food, for shelter, and for those who show kindness when others will not. Help us remember that all people are your children. Amen." Clay's amen came soft but sincere. They ate together in comfortable silence, while outside their mountain home, the first stars began to shine against the darkening sky. Dawn crept over the wind-brushed mountains, painting the frost-covered ground in shades of pink and gold. Clay was already up, stoking the cook fire when hoofbeats echoed through the clearing. His hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, but he relaxed slightly at the sight of Jimmy Wells, the circuit rider, trotting up on his paint horse. "Morning, McKinnon," Jimmy called out, dismounting stiffly. The young man pulled a folded paper from his satchel. "Got a telegram from town. Sheriff asked me special to deliver it, seeing as I was heading this way." Clay's weathered face tightened as he took the telegram. Atsa appeared in the cabin doorway, watching silently as Clay unfolded the paper. His hands trembled slightly as he read, the color draining from his face. Jimmy shifted uncomfortably, looking between them. "Well, I best be on my way. Got more deliveries up the mountain." He mounted quickly, clearly eager to leave the tension behind. After the rider disappeared down the trail, Atsa stepped closer. "What does it say?" Clay's voice was rough when he finally spoke. "Sheriff's investigating me. Says I'm..." He swallowed hard, "unlawfully harboring a native minor." He crumpled the telegram in his fist. "Someone in town must have reported us after Sunday service." Atsa's face hardened. "The Reverend?" "Could be, or Jenkins at the store. Maybe both." Clay sank onto a stump by the fire, his bad legs stretched out. Whole town was watching us. They spent the day in uneasy silence, going through their usual chores with half their attention on the tree line. Clay checked and rechecked his rifle. Atsa gathered firewood closer to the cabin than usual, her movements quick and wary. Night fell early, as it did in the mountains during autumn. Clay had just dozed off when he felt Atsa's hand on his shoulder, shaking him urgently. "Someone's out there," she whispered, her eyes wide in the darkness. "By the big pine." Clay grabbed his rifle and eased to the window. The moon cast enough light to see a dark figure standing just inside the tree line, watching the cabin. When Clay shifted for a better look, the figure melted into the shadows. "Stay here," he ordered, though Atsa was already reaching for her knife. The night air bit cold as Clay stepped onto the porch, rifle ready. He moved carefully, favoring his good leg, as he crossed to where the figure had stood. Fresh boot prints marked the frozen ground. A man's prints, heading back toward the trail. Clay followed them to the edge of the clearing before the tracks disappeared into rocky ground. Back inside, he found Atsa had already started reinforcing the door with a wooden bar. "We need to secure the windows too," she said, not looking up from her work. They worked together, speaking little as they fortified their home. Clay nailed boards across the smaller windows while Atsa gathered extra supplies: water, dried meat, ammunition, keeping everything close at hand. Later, as they sat in the darkness keeping watch, Atsa's voice came soft but clear. "I had a brother once." She paused, running her thumb along the handle of her knife. "Tommy. He was younger than me. Army took him 5 years ago. Said they were sending him to school." Her voice caught. "Never heard from him again. Everyone says he's dead." Clay studied her face in the dim light of the banked fire. "Maybe he ain't," he said gently. "Maybe that's what scares you?" Atsa's head snapped up, her eyes meeting his with a mix of anger and pain. "What do you mean?" "Hope's a dangerous thing when you've learned to live without it." Clay shifted in his chair, the old wound in his leg aching. "Sometimes it's easier to believe the worst than to keep wondering." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the pop of burning wood and the distant cry of a coyote. Finally, Atsa spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think someone's looking for me?" "Don't know," Clay admitted. "But whatever comes, we'll face it together." They settled into their watch positions. Clay by the front window, Atsa near the back door. The night stretched long before them, full of shadows and questions neither could answer. Every snapping twig, every rustle of wind through pine needles kept them alert, wondering if their visitor would return. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Clay caught Atsa's eye across the cabin. No words were needed. They both understood that everything had changed. The safe haven they'd built was threatened now, not just by the law, but by whoever lurked in the darkness beyond their walls. The morning would bring decisions to make and dangers to face. But for now, they kept their vigil. Two outcasts bound together by circumstance and growing trust, watching the night slowly give way to day. The mountain air grew sharper as November settled in. Clay and Atsa worked their way along the creek, checking trap lines they'd set for beaver and muskrat. The water gurgled over rocks worn smooth by time, while overhead, pine branches swayed in the crisp breeze. Clay paused at a bend in the creek, frowning. "Something ain't right." He pointed to disturbed leaves near the water's edge. "Those are fresh tracks. Too small for a deer." Atsa was already moving, her keen eyes following the trail. She stopped abruptly, dropping to one knee. "Here," she called, her voice urgent. Huddled against a fallen log lay a small boy, no more than 9 or 10 years old. His black hair was roughly cut, and his thin cotton shirt offered little protection against the mountain cold. Dark bruises marked his arms, visible where his sleeves had pulled up. Atsa reached for him gently. "He's breathing, but his skin's like ice." She switched to Apache, then Navajo, speaking soft words. The boy's eyelids fluttered. "We need to get him warm," Clay said, already shrugging off his coat. He wrapped it around the boy's slight frame while Atsa cradled his head. The boy mumbled something in Navajo. Atsa's eyes widened. "He says his name is Tommy." Clay lifted the boy carefully, mindful of any hidden injuries. "Can you understand everything he's saying?" "Some. It's different from Apache, but close enough." Atsa walked alongside them, her hand resting protectively on Tommy's arm. "He's asking for his mother." They hurried back to the cabin, where Clay laid Tommy on his own bed while Atsa stoked the fire. The boy drifted in and out of consciousness as they worked to warm him, feeding him spoonfuls of hot broth when he was alert enough to swallow. As evening approached, Tommy finally opened his eyes fully. He looked around the cabin in confusion before his gaze settled on Atsa. She smiled gently, speaking in a mixture of Navajo and English, until she found words he understood. "You're safe now," she assured him. "Can you tell us what happened?" Tommy's voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse. School? Far away? He touched his cropped hair. They cut, made us pray, say Jesus. Tears welled in his eyes. Hit us when we speak Dene. Clay stood by the fireplace, his face troubled. Sounds like St. Matthew's Mission School. It's 3 days' ride from here. He ran a hand through his gray hair. We ought to take him back. No! Atsa's voice cracked like a whip. She stood between Clay and the bed, her eyes blazing. They'll kill what's left of him. Look what they've already done. Tommy curled into himself at their raised voices, and Atsa immediately softened her tone, sitting beside him on the bed. Clay watched as the boy instinctively pressed closer to her, seeking comfort. He needs proper care, Clay argued, but his voice lacked conviction. He needs to be safe, Atsa countered, to speak his language, to remember who he is. She met Clay's gaze steadily. You know what happens in those places. You've seen it before. Clay looked between them, Atsa fierce and protective, Tommy trembling but trusting. The weight of the law pressed heavy on his conscience, but so did the memory of other children he'd seen broken by proper care. Finally, he sighed. Winter's coming on hard anyway. Roads will be closed soon. He moved to add wood to the fire. Reckon we couldn't travel far if we wanted to. Atsa's shoulders relaxed slightly. She knew it wasn't a permanent solution, but it was enough for now. Tommy seemed to sense the decision too, some of the fear leaving his face. As night settled over the mountain, Clay pulled his chair close to the fire, opening his worn psalter as usual. But tonight, instead of reading, he listened as Atsa's voice filled the cabin with something older than scripture. She sang softly in Apache, a melody that seemed to rise and fall like wind through canyon walls. Tommy's eyes grew heavy as he listened, his small hand clutched in Atsa's. The lullaby spoke of stars and mountains, of mothers and children, of home and belonging. Clay watched them over the top of his book. The young woman, who'd arrived so fierce and distant, now humming ancient comfort to a lost child. Tommy's breathing deepened into sleep, his face peaceful for the first time since they'd found him. In the firelight, they looked like family, sister, and brother, watched over by a weathered guardian who'd never planned on being anyone's protector. The cabin felt different somehow, as if the addition of Tommy had transformed it from a mere shelter into something more. Atsa finished her song but kept holding Tommy's hand. She looked up at Clay, her eyes soft in the dim light. My mother used to sing that to me, she said quietly, before she died at the fort. Clay nodded, understanding all she wasn't saying about loss and memory, about the things that bind people together. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the mountain in silence, while inside 3 unlikely souls found warmth in their makeshift family. The days flowed together like the mountain streams, each one bringing new rhythms to life in the cabin. Morning frost painted delicate patterns on the windows, while inside, warmth and routine took hold. Atsa stood behind Tommy near the creek, her hands guiding his small fingers as she showed him how to check the wire snares. Gentle now, she murmured. Like this? Together they lifted the trap, Tommy's face bright with concentration. Is it right? He asked, his English growing stronger each day. Perfect. Atsa squeezed his shoulder. You'll be setting them yourself soon enough? Back at the cabin, the steady thunk of Clay's axe marked time as he shaped pine boards into a proper bed frame. Sawdust covered his boots as he worked, measuring twice before each cut. The boy needed more than just a borrowed pallet on the floor. Tommy watched the construction with fascination whenever he wasn't helping Atsa. For me? He'd ask, touching the smooth wood with wonder. Sure is, Clay would answer, a smile crinkling his weathered face. Can't have you sleeping on the floor all winter. While the men worked outside, Atsa spent quiet afternoons at the table, her carving knife dancing over a piece of pine wood. She worked in secret, shooing Tommy away whenever he tried to peek. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, bringing form from formless wood. One afternoon, as golden light slanted through the cabin windows, Atsa approached Clay as he rested in his chair. She held something behind her back, suddenly shy despite their weeks together. "I made this," she said softly, bringing forth her creation. "For you." In her hands sat a wooden eagle, wings spread wide and proud. Between its talons, it clutched a small Bible, every detail carved with loving care. The bird's eyes seemed to hold wisdom, while its feathers caught the light in delicate patterns. Clay took it carefully, his rough hands gentle against the smooth wood. He stared at it for a long moment, working his jaw as emotion threatened to overwhelm him. Finally, he cleared his throat. It's something special, Atsa." He stood slowly, limping to the fireplace. With reverence, he placed the eagle on the mantel, centered above the dancing flames. It looked right there, as if the spot had been waiting for just such a guardian. That evening, the cabin filled with an unfamiliar sound: laughter. They gathered around bowls of rabbit stew, thick with wild onions, and the last of summer's carrots. Tommy told a story about a coyote and a jackrabbit, first in Navajo, then in English, his hands dancing as he spoke. Atsa corrected his translation when he stumbled, while Clay chuckled at the tale's twists. The fire crackled warmly, casting friendly shadows on walls that had known too much loneliness. Clay looked at his unlikely family. The Apache girl who'd arrived so wary, now teaching with patience. The Navajo boy finding his voice again, his own heart opening like a flower to the sun. But peace, like morning mist, can vanish with a breath of wind. In the hushed hours before dawn, Clay woke to check the fire. Something drew his eye to the window, a shadow moving against shadows, the faint crunch of frost under boots. Someone watched from the tree line, as they had before. Clay's hand moved toward his rifle, but he kept still, not wanting to alert the watcher. After a long moment, the shadow melted away into the darkness. He didn't wake Atsa or Tommy, not wanting to break their hard-won sense of safety. When morning came, Clay wrote a careful note while the others did their chores. He called Tommy over, speaking low. "Think you can do something important for me, son?" Tommy nodded eagerly, standing straighter. "Need you to take this to Reverend Curtis in town. Don't give it to anyone else, you hear? Just the preacher." Clay pressed the folded paper into Tommy's small hand. "Atsa can show you the trail?" The boy clutched the note like it was pure gold. "I can do it?" "I know you can." Clay smiled, ruffling Tommy's hair. "Be back before dark now." They watched Tommy trot down the path, Atsa's detailed directions fresh in his mind. The note was simple but urgent. "Need your counsel. Someone's watching the cabin. Can you ride up Sunday, Clay?" That evening, Tommy returned with his own note clutched proudly in his fist. The Reverend's response was equally brief. "We'll come after services. God's peace be with you." Clay tucked the paper into his Bible, saying nothing to the others about his fears. Instead, he helped Tommy clean the day's catch while Atsa baked cornbread in the cast-iron skillet. The eagle watched over them from the mantel, its wooden wings spread in silent protection, while outside, shadows lengthened across the mountain's face. Sunday dawned crisp and clear, with frost glazing the fallen leaves. While Atsa led Tommy into the forest to gather late autumn herbs, Clay waited on the cabin's front porch. The sound of hoofbeats announced Reverend Curtis's arrival, his black coat stark against the golden aspens. "Brother McKinnon," the Reverend nodded, tying his horse to the rail. His eyes took in the neat woodpile, the smoke curling from the chimney, the small garden plot cleared for spring planting. Clay gestured toward 2 chairs. "Much obliged for coming, Reverend." They settled in, the wood creaking beneath them. From somewhere in the forest came Tommy's distant laughter, carried on the mountain breeze. "Sounds like a happy child," Reverend Curtis observed, his expression troubled. "He is now." Clay leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But something ain't right. Someone's been watching us, standing in the trees at night." The Reverend's face grew grave. "That's why I came, Clay. The whispers in town, they've turned ugly. Sheriff's under pressure from the Indian Affairs Office about that girl. And some folks," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "some folks are saying you've gone native, living with heathens." Clay's jaw tightened. "They're children of God, same as any other." "I know that," the Reverend said softly. "But others? They're talking about taking matters into their own hands, especially since you took in the boy." They spoke for another hour, their voices low and serious. When the Reverend finally mounted up, his parting words hung heavy in the air. "Be careful, Brother McKinnon. Evil works in darkness." That night, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, they settled into their usual evening routine. Tommy practiced his letters by lamplight while Atsa mended a torn shirt. Clay read from his worn Bible, the familiar words bringing comfort to the cabin's warmth. The moon had risen high when a distant howl split the night. Not wolf, not coyote, but something human and haunting. Clay's hand moved toward his rifle. Then came the crash. The back wall erupted in orange flames, glass shattering as burning oil spread across the floor. "Out!" Clay shouted, grabbing Tommy from his bed. "Everyone out!" Atsa was already moving, racing to the water barrel. She thrust a bucket into Clay's hands while snatching another for herself. Together, they fought the hungry flames, throwing water on the spreading fire while Tommy ran to the creek for more. Smoke filled their lungs. Timbers groaned. The heat pressed against them like a living thing as they worked desperately to save their home. But the fire had too much of a head start. With a terrible crack, the back half of the roof collapsed inward, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. When the last flames finally died, leaving only smoking ruins, Clay limped through the wreckage. In the charred remains of what had been Tommy's new bed, he found it. A crude cross, blackened but still recognizable. Beneath it lay a scrap of paper, its edges singed. "Send her back, or next time it's your grave." They salvaged what they could: blankets, Clay's Bible, some food, and took shelter in the woodshed. The small space felt cramped but safe, its walls solid against the night. Tommy huddled between them, shivering despite the blankets. Atsa sat apart, her face illuminated by their single rescued lantern. In her hands, she held the wooden eagle she'd carved for Clay, now charred almost beyond recognition. Her fingers traced its burned features as tears slid silently down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice rough from smoke. "This is my fault. All of it." Clay shifted closer, wincing at his aggravated leg wound. "No," he said firmly. "This is the work of evil men, nothing more. But if I wasn't here, then I'd be alone, and Tommy would still be suffering at that school, and this mountain would be a poorer place." Clay's voice grew gentle. "You ain't to blame for other folks' hate." Tommy crawled over to Atsa, pressing against her side. "Stay," he pleaded in Navajo, then repeated it in English. "Please, stay." In the lantern's glow, Atsa pulled the boy close, resting her chin on his head. Her tears fell into his dark hair as she held him, the ruined eagle still clutched in one hand. Outside, the night pressed close around their tiny shelter, while inside 3 hearts beat together in the darkness, waiting for dawn. The smoking ruins of their cabin stood as a stark reminder. Violence had found them here in their mountain sanctuary. Their peace was shattered, but their bonds, forged in trust and tested by fire, held firm against the night. The autumn wind whipped through the burned ruins of their cabin as Clay saddled his horse. Atsa stood nearby, her worn shawl pulled tight against the chill, watching him check the cinch straps. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion in her eyes. Clay paused, studying her face. Ain't safe in town. Nowhere's safe now. She gestured at the blackened timbers. Besides, Tommy needs proper rest. We can't keep him in that woodshed. Clay couldn't argue with that. They gathered what little remained of their belongings and helped Tommy onto the horse. The boy's small hands gripped the saddle horn as Clay led them down the mountain trail, Atsa walking beside them. They made camp that evening beneath a stand of towering pines, the ridge offering some shelter from the wind. Tommy fell asleep quickly, wrapped in their last blanket. Clay built a small fire, careful to keep the smoke minimal. "What if they don't help us?" Atsa asked softly, staring into the flames. Clay added another stick to the fire. "Reverend Curtis will. He's a good man." One good man against a whole town. Atsa's fingers traced the burned eagle carving she'd refused to leave behind. The next morning, they rode into Turquoise Crossing just as the general store opened its doors. People stopped to stare. Whispers followed them down the dusty street. Sheriff Lott stepped out of his office, hand resting on his gun belt. Two deputies flanked him. "That's far enough, McKinnon." Clay dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Sheriff, we need help. Someone burned." "Clay McKinnon, you're under arrest?" The sheriff's voice carried across the street, drawing more onlookers. "For harboring minors without legal guardianship and interfering with government custody." "Now wait just a minute," Clay started, but the deputies were already moving forward. "Take the children into protective custody," Sheriff Lott ordered. "County's responsibility now." Atsa's eyes flashed. "No!" She reached for Tommy, but a deputy grabbed her arm. "Don't fight them," Clay called as the deputies secured his wrists. "Atsa, please, don't give them reason." Tommy began crying as they pulled him from the horse. Atsa went rigid but didn't struggle as they led her toward the jailhouse. Her eyes met Clay's, filled with betrayal and fear. "I'll fix this," he promised, as they marched him through the jail door. "I'll make it right." The cell door clanged shut, the sound echoing through the small building. Through the barred window, Clay watched them escort Atsa and Tommy to the adjacent holding room. Sheriff Lott tried questioning Atsa, but she turned her face to the wall, silent and stone-faced. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff," Clay said, gripping the iron bars. "Those children need protection." "Protection?" Lott scoffed. "From what I hear, you're the one putting them in danger, living wild up there, mixing with their heathen ways." "They're family now," Clay insisted. "We take care of each other." "Family?" The sheriff shook his head. "Law says different. Indian Affairs Office has been looking for that boy since he ran from the school, and that girl belongs back with her people." "Her people are dead," Clay's voice rose. "Tommy's school beat him. You're sending them back to suffer." "Not my problem." Sheriff Lott turned away. "Judge Williams rides circuit next week. You can make your case then." The afternoon dragged into evening. Clay paced his cell, leg throbbing, listening to Tommy's occasional whimpers through the wall. The door opened, admitting Reverend Curtis. "I've sent telegrams," the Reverend said quietly. "Called for a public hearing tomorrow morning. Town needs to see this done proper." "Thank you," Clay sagged against the bars. "But what if it ain't enough?" "Have faith, Brother McKinnon. Truth has power." After the Reverend left, Clay sank onto the thin mattress, head in his hands. Everything they'd built, the trust, the home, the family, seemed to be slipping away like sand through his fingers. In the holding room, Atsa sat with Tommy curled against her side. The boy's tears had finally dried, leaving dirty tracks on his cheeks. She thought of her mother's prayers, words spoken in two languages to bridge two worlds. For the first time since her mother's death, Atsa felt the urge to pray. "Creator," she whispered in Apache, then switched to English. "God of Clay's Bible, help us, please." Tommy stirred. "What are you doing?" "Talking to Creator," she explained softly. Would you like to learn how? The boy nodded. Together, they spoke to the sky beyond their window, mixing Navajo, Apache, and English words into something new, a family's prayer, born of desperation and hope. In his cell, Clay heard their murmured voices through the wall. He recognized the cadence of prayer, though he couldn't understand the words. Tears burned his eyes as he added his own petition to theirs, asking for mercy, for justice, for a miracle to restore what they'd lost. Night settled over the jailhouse. 3 hearts beat in separate rooms, yet bound together by something stronger than iron bars or legal papers. Their home might be ashes, their future uncertain, but in the darkness, they each held on to the truth they'd discovered on that mountain. Love makes its own kind of family, one that even fire cannot destroy. 3 days crawled by like molasses in winter. The turquoise crossing courthouse, usually reserved for land disputes and cattle theft, now held nearly every soul in town. Morning sunlight filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor as Judge Harrison Williams settled his considerable frame behind the bench. The judge's weathered face bore the hard lines of 30 years Army service. His steel-gray eyes swept the crowded room before fixing on Clay, who stood straight despite his aching leg. "Mr. McKinnon," Judge Williams began, his voice carrying the snap of old command. "You stand accused of harboring minors without legal guardianship and interfering with government custody. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor." Clay's voice was quiet but firm. Reverend Curtis was the first to testify. He rose from the front pew, Bible in hand, and faced the packed courthouse. "I've known Clay McKinnon for 15 years, the Reverend declared. "He's a God-fearing man who's never turned away from helping those in need. When others looked away, he spent his last dollar to save that girl from public shame." The judge's expression remained stone-faced. "Admirable sentiment, Reverend, but good intentions don't override the law." A rustle went through the crowd as Atsa stood suddenly. Her dark eyes held determination as she raised her hand. "Your Honor, I wish to speak." Murmurs rippled through the courthouse. The judge frowned, but after a moment's consideration, he nodded. "Very well." Atsa walked to the front, her steps measured and dignified despite the stairs. She wore her best dress, the one Clay had bought her for church, and held her head high. "My name is Atsa," she began in clear, perfect English that surprised many in the room. "Before Clay McKinnon bought my contract, I was treated like property, like something broken to be sold cheap." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "But Clay never owned me. He gave me choice, dignity, a home where I could be myself." The courtroom grew still as she continued. "He reads from his Bible every night but never forced me to listen. He taught me about his God through actions, not words. When Tommy came to us hurt and afraid, Clay chose mercy over law." Her eyes met the judge's. "If that's a crime, then perhaps the law needs changing." The silence that followed her words felt heavy with meaning. Several women in the crowd dabbed at their eyes. Even Sheriff Lott looked uncomfortable. Then Tommy stepped forward, small fingers clutching Atsa's skirt. "Please, sir," he said in careful English. "May I speak too?" The judge's stern expression softened slightly. "Come forward, son." Tommy walked to the front, his voice trembling at first but growing stronger. "At the school, they said I wasn't Tommy anymore. Said I had to be Thomas and forget my grandmother's songs." He glanced at Atsa, "But she gave me back my name. She teaches me our old ways while Clay teaches me new ones. He searched for the word, family. A woman in the back began to cry softly. The judge removed his spectacles, polishing them slowly as he studied the trio before him. "Sheriff Lott," he said finally, "approach the bench." The 2 men spoke in low tones for several minutes. The crowd waited. Breath held. Clay's hands gripped the rail so hard his knuckles went white. At last, Judge Williams cleared his throat. Having heard the testimony and reviewed the evidence, I find insufficient cause to maintain these charges. Case dismissed. Relief swept through the courthouse, but the judge wasn't finished. However, he fixed Clay with a stern look. I strongly advise you to seek formal adoption papers for both children. The law may be slow to change, Mr. McKinnon, but it must be respected. Fail to do so, and you risk future prosecution. Clay nodded solemnly. Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. Mayor Thompson stood up from his seat. If I may, Your Honor, I move to call a town vote regarding the McKinnon family's right to reside here. The judge gestured his approval. Those in favor of allowing Clay McKinnon and his wards to remain in Turquoise Crossing, raise your hands. Hands rose slowly at first, then faster. Reverend Curtis's shot up immediately. The general store owner, who'd once refused ATSA service, raised his. Even Sheriff Lott, after a long moment, lifted his hand. Motion carries, the judge declared, bringing down his gavel. As the crowd began to disperse, Reverend Curtis approached Clay. Brother McKinnon, the church owns a fine plot of land just behind the ridge. Good soil, fresh spring nearby. He smiled. Might make a fine place to build a new home. Clay looked at Atsa and Tommy, who had moved to stand beside him. What do you reckon? He asked them. Would you like to stay in town? Tommy nodded eagerly. Atsa's eyes shone with unshed tears as she took Clay's weathered hand in hers. The courthouse slowly emptied, leaving the small family standing in a shaft of autumn sunlight. Through the window, they could see the church ridge rising green against the blue sky, promising a new beginning. The church barn smelled of fresh hay and old leather, but it felt like heaven compared to a jail cell. Clay spread their salvaged blankets on clean straw while Atsa hung herbs from the rafters to dry. Tommy curled up in the corner, already claiming his spot beneath a high window. It ain't much, Clay said, looking around the sparse space, but it'll do till we get our own walls up. Atsa nodded, arranging their few belongings with care. It's more than enough. The next morning brought the sound of wagon wheels. Several townspeople arrived with tools, axes, saws, and shovels. Even the blacksmith contributed a box of bent nails he'd straightened himself. Reckon you could use these, he mumbled, not meeting Atsa's eyes directly, but nodding respectfully. They spent that first week clearing land behind the chapel. The plot Reverend Curtis offered spread wide beneath tall pines, with a clear spring bubbling up through moss-covered rocks. Clay's bad leg slowed him some, but he worked steady, marking trees and planning where their cabin would stand. While Clay worked the land, Atsa began gathering herbs from the surrounding hills. She'd learned well from her grandmother, and her knowledge soon proved valuable. When Jake Miller's youngest fell sick with fever, his wife Sarah found Atsa at the livery stable. Please, Sarah whispered, wringing her hands. The doctor's 2 days away, and little Mary's burning up something fierce. Atsa followed without hesitation. She spent hours brewing willow bark tea and laying cool cloths on the child's forehead. By morning, Mary's fever had broken. Sarah Miller hugged Atsa tight, tears in her eyes. Word spread quick in a small town. Soon other mothers sought Atsa's help for various ailments, colicky babies, arthritis, winter coughs. Each success chipped away at the wall of distrust, one family at a time. One afternoon, Clay rode to meet Circuit Judge Parker about adoption papers. The judge's weathered face creased with concern as he reviewed their case. It's unusual, he admitted, shuffling through documents. No precedent for adopting native wards in this territory. Might take some creative legal work. He looked up at Clay. But I reckon those children deserve a proper home. We'll sort it out. Meanwhile, Tommy caught the attention of Miss Adelaide Watson, the town's schoolmarm. She found him watching through the schoolhouse window one morning, eyes wide with curiosity as she taught the alphabet. Would you like to learn? She asked gently. Tommy nodded eagerly. Soon he was spending afternoons with Miss Watson, carefully tracing letters in the dust and sounding out simple words. One day she approached Atsa after church. I could teach you too, she offered, if you'd like. Atsa hesitated, then squared her shoulders. Yes, ma'am, I would. The lessons became a daily ritual. Tommy raced through primers while Atsa tackled more advanced texts, her mother's early teachings providing a strong foundation. Miss Watson marveled at their quick minds and determination. Clay worked sunrise to sunset, his hands growing rough with splinters and saw marks. The townspeople continued bringing what they could spare: a broken chair to fix, extra shingles, a cracked window that could be reglazed. Even Sheriff Lott contributed an old door he'd been keeping in his barn. One evening, as shadows lengthened across their cleared land, Clay called Atsa and Tommy over to his workbench. He'd been carving something in secret all week, working by lamplight after they'd gone to sleep. Got something to show you, he said, pulling aside a canvas cover. There, carved in solid oak salvaged from their burned cabin, were the words McKinnon Ridge in deep, careful letters. Clay had adorned the beam with small details: pine branches in the corners, a rising sun, and a soaring eagle like the one Atsa had once carved for him. Figured every home needs a proper name, he said softly, and every family needs a proper sign to mark it. Atsa's hand trembled as she traced the letters. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she realized what this meant. Not just a home, but a name, a belonging. Tommy pressed close against her side, his small fingers finding hers. Clay's strong arm encircled them both, pulling them close. They stood together in the fading light, 3 hearts beating as one beneath the evening sky. The beam before them wasn't just wood and paint. It was a promise, a new beginning. Behind them, the chapel bell tolled for evening service, its clear notes floating across their freshly cleared land. The sound carried hope on its wings, ringing out across McKinnon Ridge, where a family had finally found its place to grow. The cabin rose steadily through October's golden days. Neighbors helped set massive pine beams, each one squared by Clay's careful hand. Even Sheriff Lott pitched in, his earlier suspicions softening as he worked alongside Atsa, passing nails and tools. On a crisp Sunday morning, Reverend Curtis gathered the town for a blessing. He stood before the half-finished walls, Bible in hand, while smoke from the newly built chimney curled skyward. Lord, he intoned, bless this home and those who dwell within. May it stand as testament to your grace, which knows no boundaries of blood or birth. Atsa's reputation grew as autumn deepened. Women who once crossed the street to avoid her now knocked at the barn door, seeking remedies for their ailments. She treated each with quiet dignity, sharing the wisdom of her grandmother's people without bitterness for past slights. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted their peace one afternoon. A rider appeared at the edge of their clearing, followed by 3 others. Atsa dropped her basket of herbs, trembling. There, astride a paint horse, sat her brother Nilchi, older, scarred, but unmistakably alive. Sister, he called in Apache, I've come to take you home. Clay emerged from the cabin, rifle lowered but ready. Instead of confrontation, he spoke softly. Sun's getting low. Might be you'd all care to share our supper? Tension crackled as they gathered around the rough-hewn table. Nilchi's warriors watched every movement while Tommy huddled close to Atsa. The meal passed in strained silence, broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls. Later, as pine logs popped in the fireplace, Atsa faced her brother. I mourned you, she said softly, but this is my path now. With white men? Nilchi spat. Have you forgotten who you are? I remember everything, Atsa replied, her voice steady. Mother's songs, grandmother's medicines, the taste of mesquite bread. But here I am free to be both, to heal, to learn, to build something new. Nilchi studied her face in the flickering light. The frightened girl he'd left behind was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her own mind. You are not afraid, he said finally. No, she answered. Not anymore. Dawn found Nilchi and his men preparing to ride out. He touched his forehead to Atsa's in farewell, a gesture of respect between equals. Without another word, they vanished into the morning mist, leaving Atsa standing tall between her chosen father and brother, her heart at peace. The mountain snow melted into streams, carrying winter's memories downstream. Fresh buds dotted the tree branches around McKinnon Ridge, and morning birdsong replaced the howl of cold winds. Clay sat at the courthouse in Turquoise Crossing, his weathered hands steady as he signed the final papers making Tommy legally his son. The boy bounced on his heels, dark eyes shining with joy. Back home, Atsa had changed too. Each Sunday morning, she smoothed her dress and took her place in the church pews. The white children who once drew back now shared their hymn books with her, their shoulders touching as they sang. After services, she joined Mrs. Curtis, the preacher's wife, in turning the soil behind the chapel. Together they planted rows of beans, squash, and healing herbs. "These will help with fever," Atsa explained, pressing sage seeds into the dark earth. Mrs. Curtis nodded, genuinely interested. Out in the woods, Clay showed Tommy how to set snares, the boy's small hands mimicking his father's careful movements. Back at their cabin, Atsa spent evenings bent over her mother's old herbal knowledge, carefully translating the wisdom into English. Her neat script filled page after page with remedies passed down through generations. One warm afternoon, a little girl tripped on the boardwalk outside the general store. Her mother rushed to help, then paused as Atsa approached with a damp cloth. Without hesitation, the woman smiled. "Much obliged, Miss McKinnon," she said, accepting Atsa's help. That evening, the family gathered around their hearth fire. Tommy whittled a piece of pine while Clay mended a bridle. Atsa picked up the worn leather psalter, running her fingers over its familiar cover. She opened to a dog-eared page and began to read aloud. Her voice was hesitant at first, but grew stronger with each verse. Clay looked up from his work, a quiet smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. The firelight danced across Atsa's face as she read, no longer the defiant girl from the auction block, but a young woman who had found her place. The townspeople's whispers of "too wild" had faded like morning mist, leaving only Atsa herself, strong, gentle, and finally home. Easter morning dawned bright and clear over McKinnon Ridge. The new cabin stood proud against the awakening sky, its fresh-cut timber gleaming in the early light. Inside, Atsa smoothed her best dress while Tommy fidgeted with his Sunday collar. Clay held the restored wooden eagle carving in his rough hands, studying how the morning sun caught its mended wings. "Reckon it's time?" Clay said softly, stepping out onto the porch with his hammer. The eagle had taken weeks to repair after the fire, but Atsa's patient hands had pieced it back together, stronger than before. The Bible in its talons still pointed true north. Tommy watched, wide-eyed, as Clay carefully positioned the carving above the doorframe. Each nail rang out clear and sure, securing their symbol of hope to its rightful place. The eagle seemed to keep watch over their threshold, a guardian of their hard-won peace. Inside, the cabin smelled of fresh bread and simmering stew. They gathered around their new table, heads bowed, as Clay offered grace. The walls echoed with quiet laughter as they shared the meal, passing the cornbread and telling stories. Tommy's eyes shone as Clay presented him with a leather-bound family Bible. "Write your name, son," Clay encouraged. "Make it official-like." Tommy's tongue poked out in concentration as he carefully printed Thomas McKinnon on the first page. Atsa squeezed his shoulder, pride warming her smile. As evening approached, Atsa stood in the doorway, gazing out over the ridge where spring flowers dotted the grass. The setting sun painted the clouds in shades of rose and gold. "Bought for $1?" she whispered, touching the eagle carving. "Freed by grace." The church bell began to toll in the valley below, calling the faithful to Easter service. Clay appeared beside her, offering his arm with quiet dignity. She took it, feeling the strength of belonging flow between them. Together, they walked down the path toward the chapel, Tommy skipping ahead. No whispers followed them now, no suspicious glances or turned backs. The town's lights winked on one by one, welcoming them home. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.